Hey, what's up, guys? This is Benny Ricciardi with rotocurve.com, and I'm here with another one of our NBA strategy session videos. Today's video, we're going to talk a little bit about how minutes equal money. It's an old adage that we hear all the time in daily fantasy, but I don't really think many people understand exactly how to use it and exactly what we mean when we say it. So we're going to call up the slideshow and talk about different ways that minutes can equal money for you in daily fantasy. The first thing we're going to talk about is PPM projections, which is points per minute. The next thing we're going to talk about is how injuries affect minutes, and that can equal money. The next thing we're going to talk about is how changes in the rotation can affect minutes and how that can equal money. And we're going to finish up by talking about matchups and how the way that a team is going to have to match up against another team could be another way that the minutes could equal money. The first thing we're going to talk about is the points per minute projection. Basketball is a sport that lends itself to being the most predictable of the major daily fantasy sports. Players tend to produce at a trackable and predictable clip. Basically what this means is if you have a guy like Russell Westbrook, who we see on the left-hand side, when Westbrook plays 35 plus minutes, he usually scores around 50 fantasy points. When he has a game where he only scores 40 fantasy points, if you look through his game log, most of the time it's because he only played like 28 to 30 minutes, usually due to a blowout. More often than not, it's because his team is blowing somebody out, as the Thunder only had a couple games this year where they were on the wrong end of a blowout. And basically what we're talking about here is, if you give a guy like Russell Westbrook 20 minutes, he's going to produce about a fantasy point and a half per minute. If you give him 40 minutes, he's still going to produce the same 1.5 fantasy points per minute. So the only thing that really changes is the number of minutes. That's what varies with the production, that he has. The production per minute usually stays pretty similar no matter how many minutes a guy plays, but the number of minutes per game that he plays is what can really change his fantasy score. Therefore, if you have a guy who normally gets you 1 or 2 fantasy points per minute, or a half a fantasy point per minute, or 3/4 of a fantasy point per minute, if he plays 10 or 15 minutes at, half a fantasy point per minute, he's going to get you, 5 to 7 points. If he plays 30 minutes, he's going to get you 15. If he plays 40 minutes, he's going to get you 20 if he scores half a fantasy point per minute. And that's what we mean by that, is it's very predictable in the sport of basketball. If you can predict how many minutes a guy's going to play, the points per minute that he scores is usually a pretty solid number that you can use and make some solid projections off of. Therefore, when you know that, someone's going to play a certain number of minutes, you take their points per minutes multiplied by the number of minutes they're going to play, and it usually gives you a pretty good idea or a pretty close estimate of how many fantasy points they're going to score. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is injuries. Now, with injuries, there's a lot of ways that minutes are going to equal money. The easiest example is the guy subbing in for the injured player. So the Charlotte Hornets earlier in the year, when Al Jefferson went out, Cody Zeller went in for Al Jefferson. So you can pretty much take Cody Zeller and plug him into however many minutes you were getting out of Al Jefferson. The two of them don't have too much of a difference between the fantasy points per minute. So you take the fantasy points per minute that Zeller gets, multiply it by the number of minutes that, Al Jefferson used to get now that Zeller is in that role, and you get a nice, easy number that he can come out with. And with his price still being cheap because he was a bench guy before he got the starting job, now you can predict, okay, if this is how many minutes I think he's going to get, this is how many points he gets per minute, this is how many points he should wind up with, and now we can divide that by his price and figure out what his value is. Now, that's the easy example. The savvy play, though, is the other guys who see a bump. And a good example of this is the Orlando Magic, before the Tobias Harris trade. They basically had 5 players that played the 1, 2, 3, and 4 spots for them. So the guard, the point guard, shooting guard, small forward, and power forward spot. Elf Payton was strictly a point guard. Victor Oladipo would play the 2 unless Elf Payton wasn't in the game, and then he would slide over to the 1. Fournier would play the 2 unless, him and Oladipo were in the game. He would slide over to the 3. Tobias Harris would either play the small forward or the power forward role, and Aaron Gordon would play the power forward role. So whenever one of these guys was out, Fournier was the guy that was coming off the bench. So whenever one of those guys was out, you kind of knew that Fournier was going to get subbed into the lineup and was going to be a good play. So that's the easy example. But the savvy play is also to realize that, those 5 guys were basically splitting all the minutes at those positions. So if any one of the 5 happened to be out, that means that the minutes were solidified for the other 4, where they're all going to see a bump up in minutes. So Elf Payton might have played 28 to 30 minutes a game, but whenever one of those 5 guys was out, he was playing 35 to 36 minutes. Same goes for Oladipo, same goes for Fournier, same goes for Harris, same goes for Gordon. So anytime one of those five was out, you knew that not only is Fournier, who was subbing in for one of those five, going to have a good game, but you could also up the production of the other three guys because you were upping the minutes of the other three guys. It's a great way to find guys who are underpriced because even though their minutes are going to be bumped up today, most of the time the sites didn't bump up their price unless we knew that injury that happened was going to be some kind of long-term injury, that we had advanced knowledge of before the pricing came out for the next slate. It's also a very profitable strategy to stack guys that are in this situation that are playing in the GPP. A good example of this is the Phoenix Suns forwards. Earlier in the year, when Markieff Morris was getting benched, you had guys like John Lore, TJ Warren, even Mirza Teletovic, who were all guys who were playing like 15 to 20 minutes a game. And then all of a sudden, when you take the 35, 36 minutes a game Morris was playing and you put him on the bench, well, that's a lot of minutes that opens up for the rest of these guys. So if you were somebody like Draft Cheat, who when he had one of his big days earlier in the year, wound up stacking up all those forwards on the Phoenix Suns, you got three guys that are all priced at $4,000 like bench players that are now playing, 30 to 35 minutes when they were only playing 20 minutes. Maybe at 20 minutes, they were only producing 20 fantasy points and were priced at 4K. But now that they're playing 30 to 35 minutes, those guys are producing closer to 30 fantasy points per game. And, at the same 4K, that's giving you 6-7 times value. And if you would have put a bunch of those guys together to make up for the minutes that you lost with a guy like Markieff Morris when he got benched, or when some other guys get injured, that's a good example of how minutes can translate into money for you. Next thing we're going to talk about is the rotation changes. When coaches decide to switch up the playing time, either because the team isn't playing well or they're just going to try something different to see if they can jumpstart somebody who hasn't been shooting well or hasn't been scoring well. Prices are slower to adjust to this than they are to adjust to other things because they're based on past performance. So even though we know that somebody might be seeing 30 to 35 minutes today when they normally only see 20 to 25, the price is still going to be what the price was when they were 20 to 25 minute a game player. It takes a couple games for the sites to really get the adjustments going with these prices. Like I said, because one of the things that's in all these algorithms has to do with the past performances. So here are some examples of that. The Chicago Bulls, Mirotic started the year off playing power forward next to Pau Gasol. And then they would bring Joakim Noah and Taj Gibson off the bench, which kind of left Bobby Portis as an odd man out. Eventually, in the middle of the season, they decided that it was crazy for them to leave some of their more talented players on the bench while a guy like Tony Snell was playing 30 to 35 minutes. So what they decided to do was move Mirotic back to the small forward spot, which now opened up minutes at the power forward spot for Taj Gibson. Again, his price was still low, but now he was getting more playing time, more minutes equal more fantasy production, and more fantasy production for the same price is how we make money. So another way that minutes equal money. The Kings did something similar earlier in this year where they switched that small ball lineup. After Willie Cauley-Stein was out for a little while, Omri Caspi became a guy who they decided they were going to start playing more and more minutes. Now, when they decided to make this switch, Caspi's price on DraftKings was below $5,000. He was now playing 38 to 42 minutes a game and putting up 30 to 40 fantasy points, but was still priced as a guy below 5K. So if you can get a guy that's going to give you, 35, 40 fantasy points for below 5K, he's somebody you're going to put in your roster every day, and we saw it a lot. The same thing kind of happened with the Grizzlies. You had Zach Randolph, who got benched in order so that they could play Jeff Green at the 4 and Barnes at the 3 and, Courtney Lee and Conley all on the court together with Marc Gasol. When they decided to go to that small ball lineup, you were able to get guys like Jeff Green and Matt Barnes for really cheap for a couple games until the, minutes caught up to the minutes and the production caught up to, the price that they had. Again, on the flip side, you also had a guy like Zebo who you couldn't play at this point in time because he was losing minutes. So if you have a guy that's losing minutes like Zebo was in that situation, minutes equaling money also works on the bottom end. It gives you guys that you don't want to be on like Zebo when he was in that situation. So the last thing we're going to talk about is due to matchups. Matchups can sometimes change the minutes that guys see. Big men may play less versus a team that plays a lot of that small ball lineup. So a team going against the Golden State Warriors, there's definitely going to be stretches in the game where they go small, and the other team may have to take out their big bruising center because he wouldn't be able to guard anybody that's out there on the floor. Stretch fours tend to see less times against teams that have two true big men, and coaches tend to adjust their rotation to give them the best matchups. A good example of this is a guy like Alex Len. Alex Len is basically a center. But whenever the Phoenix Suns play a team that employs two big men, he tends to see a lot more time on the floor. Instead of the 18 to 24 minutes he's been getting, sometimes he sees 25 to 30 minutes in order for them to better match up. They'll put Chandler on the team's true center and put a guy like Len on the power forward, which is kind of what they did against Utah. You know, if they're going up against a Utah team that has a healthy Favors and a healthy Gobert, they're not going to be able to roll out some of the smaller guys that they roll out in that forward spot, like a Markieff Morris when they still had him at only 6'6", 6'7". You know, when you're going up against a guy like Favors, you really need another big guy. So another 6'11", 7-footer like Alex Len is a better matchup in that situation. So if you know that a guy like Alex Len is going up against a team that has two big men, you know that he's probably going to be one of those guys who gets a bump up in minutes. So bump up in minutes, you look at his points per minute, he's going to wind up scoring maybe 25 to 30 fantasy points instead of 18 to 25. You can get him at the same price. That's the kind of situation where, due to matchups, you can foresee somebody, you know, playing some more minutes. It doesn't only work with the low end either. You know, a guy like Kawhi Leonard, whenever the Suns play a team that has a stud wing player, he usually finds himself playing a few extra minutes because he has to guard that stud wing player. I know a lot of people will stay away from him thinking he's going to exert all his energy on the defensive end, trying to shut down whether it be Kevin Durant or LeBron James or Jimmy Butler or whoever else it might happen to be. But if you watch Kawhi Leonard play over the course of the season, you know, it doesn't really matter on the other end who's guarding him, and it doesn't really matter who he's guarding. It's not like he doesn't play as hard as he can every possession he's out there. We've seen him put up some really good games in some really tough matchups where he also guarded the other team's best player. Because let's face it, he basically guards the other team's best player every night. So, like I said, sometimes due to the matchup, you're able to find guys that are in you know, sneaky spots that other people might not be playing that can help you make some serious money on the day. So these are just some of the ways that minutes can help equal money for you. Like I said, the NBA is one of those sports that is the easiest to predict based off of past performance. You know, the more minutes a guy gets, the more opportunity that guy is going to get to score fantasy points. And most of the time, it usually leads to a higher score for you. So thank you for joining us here for our NBA strategy session. Make sure to get over to rotocurve.com and sign up for an account if you don't already have one. You can follow us at RotoCurve over on Twitter, or you can follow me over on Twitter at BennyR11. Thank you guys for joining us here. And as always, stay classy, DFS.